We're almost reaching 2 years since the Covid-19 attacked Rwanda, and we as journalists, we've also had our own experience and the effect it has had on us professionally and personally. I want to have a conversation with my colleague Julius Bizimungu from CNBC on how he can describe his experience throughout the pandemic. Julius, welcome to Tarifa's table of conversations.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank God you're still breathing, because this pandemic has had completely dangerous effects on people, including taking someone's life.
Absolutely.
Happy that you're still alive and kicking. So take me through your experience. What has the pandemic been like to you? What did you observe throughout the past months?
I think from the social perspective, what we've learned is that the pandemic has had enormous effect on us as journalists, but also the people, the citizens in general. When you talk about, Rwandans, you cannot exclude journalists, for instance. So if you talk about Africans who are affected by the pandemic, you cannot exclude journalists, because journalists are dealing with the pandemic every day, whether in terms of reporting. I think, so journalists are always on the front line. It's pretty much like the healthcare workers. You go to, fetch these stories straight to the sources. You're meeting these people who are affected. You understand the magnitude of the pandemic. I personally contracted COVID just last year, approaching the end of last year, and I tweeted about my experience. I even wrote a very short piece about it on LinkedIn. It generated more than 1,500 views. And the idea was that COVID is real. We've seen a lot of misinformation, especially during the beginning and throughout the COVID period. And so if you haven't experienced that, even though you've reported about that, but sometimes you haven't experienced that, people think it's not true, but COVID is real. That's one thing we've learned. It's real. I personally had it. You had, weird flu, you had cold that you can never understand, your body is weak, but you're experiencing sometimes depression because you don't know what exactly is happening. And all these are signs that you're suffering.
Throughout 2020, then 2021, you held so many conversations, interviews with both government officials, people in business, private sector, and individuals. What are the major highlights that you picked? What did you take from what these people were telling you from your interviews?
Let's go a little bit back when the pandemic began. End of 2019, December, literally the beginning in March, that's when we had the first case in Rwanda. And one of the reasons, because the flow of information was at a much slower pace. First of all, because the understanding around the pandemic was, people did not have the right understanding about the pandemic. First of all, it was a pandemic that people were not ready. Countries were not ready. Even those countries that had the financial muscle and the liquidity to deal with the pandemic, they took so much time to respond. And so most of the developing countries, or least developed countries, we talk about especially those in Africa and Rwanda itself, we were relying on information that came later, and so responding to the pandemic took a little bit of time. Now, another lesson that we got is that most of our systems, when I talk about healthcare systems, were not really developed. The government had a lot of priorities, most of the African governments.
So you're saying the pandemic was like a checkup?
You would say so, because think about how many people started investing in logistics. When they talk about just logistics around healthcare, getting simple things as testing kits from one place to another. In a few countries, you started seeing countries, some of them starting to invest in drone technology.
Do you have particular interviews that ring bell? You picked certain things and they characterized your experience throughout the pandemic.
I think one of the interviews, we've had several interviews, but one of the interviews we've had, especially with RDB, I've had a couple interviews with the deputy CEO of RDB and some with Claire as the CEO.
What was it about and what did you pick? Like, why this interview? What happened?
One of the outstanding things, out of these interviews, especially these interviews between these two people, is that you could tell that there was a sense of urgency. Because a lot was at stake at that time. The government had realized over time the pandemic was having enormous impact on the lives of people, but also the economy. Remember, in 2020 alone, we had minus 3 point something recession. Our economy was in a recession by that time. And over time, when you speak to these leaders, you could tell that they understand that there's an urgency of dealing with the pandemic. And the urgency I'm talking about, first of all, you're talking about how do you deal with the disruption of supply chains. We get most of our sugar we export most of our sugar, right? More than, I think, 80%. Right? Rice is the same thing, most of other products. And the agency was like, how do we make sure that we get these things on time? How comes that we didn't think about the things like this? And that's when the things, programs like Build and Manufacture to Recover program came about. One of the things we've learned is to be, one of the interviews I've done a couple interviews, whether the finance minister, minister of agriculture, those are the interviews that come to my mind right away. But when you took...
There could have been a particular point that came from one of those interviews and you didn't like it.
Honestly, one of the things, it was an argument, I think, with the Minister of Finance. Okay. One of the arguments that was brought up, was, remember the IMF African department last year was celebrating 60 years. And one of the biggest questions out of that conversation, and I remember there was a panel with Donald Kaberuka, the former president of the African Development, Ngozi of Trade Organization. And one of the arguments was we had the so-called structured transformation programs that the IMF has forced developing countries to implement over the years, literally half a century. These programs, when you look at analysis, they haven't yielded anything, no tangible result, especially for African countries. And now, as African finance ministers, governors of central banks, what exactly are you doing about it? Are we going to sit behind and say, there's nothing we can do about it?
And what was the response?
Well, honestly, finance minister was, I would say, was tight-lipped. And
you wanted to throw him under the bus. Okay, I get it.
Yeah, but I mean, this is a conversation we have to have.
It can be disappointing.
Yeah.
So tell me, when you look at the pandemic as a journalist, what effect has it had on you career-wise, like professionally?
First of all, in terms of profession, I think, for me, I would say it has taught us to have a sense of urgency in terms of reporting. One, there was a time when it was really hard to
report about.
Why?
Because Most people are even ignorant about it. Like most journalists didn't even know what to ask and what to verify, you know.
But also the self-awareness.
You had to learn a lot about it.
You had to learn a lot about, because the pandemic, you know, where do you get the right information? What kind of efforts do you use to get the right information?
And that brings me to a very important question.
Yeah.
Personally, I had a lot of problems with accessing information, especially at a time when government was still sensitive about what to tell the public, what to release. And we reached a point where just even to know how many people have tested positive was a disaster. Like, government didn't want to say anything about that until at a later stage, because government didn't even know how to treat these cases. On your side, what kind of difficulties did you face in the beginning, or even until now?
I think, well, that's one of the challenges, I would say, but I would say it's a frustration. First of all, frustration because when you look at the reporting around the pandemic, mostly here, it was not around the number of cases that the country has registered, but there was a lot of science around COVID-19 that journalists wouldn't report about, right? So, as media, what do you do to make extra effort to go out there, go to international journals, like bring the right information? Because in the middle of the pandemic, people are desperately looking for information.
Yeah.
So the moment your stories are only going to revolve around, oh, Rwanda has registered 2 COVID cases, 5 cases, people get tired of this kind of information.
Yeah, you need something.
At the end of the day, you want to bring the right, so many science out there, you know, the variants, right? You know, what kind of effects does that have on Africa, for instance? I had a panel discussion with some of the top experts at the end of last year, looking at the impact of Omicron in Africa, African healthcare systems, but also the economies. Now, how you go about, you know, getting extra information, like going into journals, trying to speak to the right people, to get to understand that there's so much that people need. I didn't know until last year that the World Health Organization was working with a few countries to take samples from a few countries to go and test them in other countries, because so many healthcare systems in countries are still not developed.
Wow.
Right? Now, if you have South Africa being able to detect Omicron variant
from another country,
what does that say about its healthcare system? What can we learn about it? These are the things that people want to learn.
Tell me, what are your observations in regard to communication, this specifically for Rwanda? How do you describe how you access information, how government communicates? What are your observations?
I think I would say I'm very frustrated with a few officials. I'll be honest with you.
Why?
Because accessing information has been hard. It's been very hard.
Can you mention names or institutions?
RBC, I'll be honest with you. I can't tell you how many times we've tried to
reach out to them.
The RBC. I'm not saying they don't have a lot of priorities and things to address, but how much time do you dedicate to the media, especially if you understand the value of the media? The media that is reaching out to the people you're trying to address. The point I'm bringing is awareness. You can't tell me that you failed to get at least one person to go and speak to the people out of how many officials in the office.
How do you usually go about that kind of frustration?
I think sometimes you
flip your finger.
No. I've learned, one thing I've learned is to rely on independent experts, right?
But did you...
Instead of killing the story, I would try to find an independent expert And even though we might not get exactly the same insights that we're looking for, but at least you're going to create a conversation that may spark someone who refuses to talk to you. Maybe sometimes because he doesn't understand.
Are there officials you appreciate in terms of communication? I mean, speak not only on government, but even in private sector.
I think I appreciate Kavera.
Who is Kavera?
The still the spokesperson of Rwanda National Police.
Why?
I think with communication, he's been always there. You know, if you needed information, his office was always there. Maybe they have their own challenges, especially.
But you're mentioning a person who was speaking or is still speaking on behalf of the champion of the task force. Had no choice. Is it because of the nature of the assignment or the nature of where he comes from?
I think it's the nature. I would say it's the nature of a person. You think RBC did not understand the urgency of communication because they were in the middle of the pandemic. They were in that position. But I think it all comes down to an individual. How do you understand the media? How do you go? Do you even have? Sometimes we also need to strengthen our communication departments in all these in all these ministries and government agencies.
What effect does it have on your career or your professional, like engagements when you have difficulties accessing information?
I think over time you get frustrated by it, but also in the long term you tend to adapt. Adaptability is very important, and in this case,
how do you adapt to lack of information?
No.
How do you do that?
If one government official refuses to give you information, it doesn't mean that there are no people who can not give you that information.
Okay, I see, right? I get it.
People who can give you that information.
Okay.
Maybe they're not going to tell you that we know RBC had 10,000 cases last night, but they have an idea, on average, maybe how many cases will be registered, right?
I see. Okay.
So I've learned to use, analysts trying to find a way of going around issues instead of ignoring issues. But because at the end of the day, people want information.
How would you describe journalism today, in Rwanda particularly, with all the trends and the changes of our industry across the world, and the advent of social media?
First of all, I think I'm glad that media houses in Rwanda are trying to adapt. I'm sure you agree with me that we've been trying to adapt. A few years ago, the print media was really big. Everybody was reading newspapers.
But it's no more. It's gone.
What do you think media houses are doing? One, they're trying to adapt, because if you don't adapt, going to go out of business. Now, you've had institutions, for instance, my former employer at times, where the company was trying so hard to make sure that they make a smooth transition towards
digital.
Yeah. You're having a multimedia department that wasn't there before. That's changed. You're having a very big presence online that wasn't there. You're creating a team that is fully dedicated to, constantly updating social media platforms.
What do you think is there a particular gap or something missing, in the industry?
Magnus, I think, I'll be honest with you, there's still lack of understanding of the role of media among most of our officials, or they probably rather ignore it deliberately. Because the reason why I'm saying that is we still have a very big challenge at accessing information in Rwanda. It's not about, institutions, it's about, I think, individuals. I think as a society we also evolve with time. I think there's a need.
But what about on the side of the industry, like practitioners, media houses, journalists? you don't see a role they have to play in whatever gaps are in there?
Of course there is. You know, practitioners are not saints. When I talk about, for instance, when it comes to making extra effort, sometimes I would say we are lazy in terms of collecting information. If you call somebody who's supposed to give you information and you don't get it, and you decide to go and go to another story, you don't know the impact of the story that you are going to do, it means you're not doing it.